I'm gonna need you to free up this table. We have paying customers waiting. Our driver's just a few minutes away. We'll be happy to order as soon as he arrives with our... Ma'am, the table.
Just a few minutes, please.
I'm sorry, but I need this table now.
They can sit with us.
And who exactly are you?
Someone who already ordered.
Nobody in that cafe knew who Eleanor and Henry Carlisle were. The hostess didn't. The barista didn't. Sabrina Cole certainly didn't. Or she would have behaved very differently when she pulled the chair out from under a 73-year-old man who could barely stand. And Darius Bennett didn't know either. He just saw an old man shaking, an old woman trying to hold it together, and a manager who had decided their dignity was less important than a table turnover. He had $21 to his name. He spent the morning splitting one breakfast 4 ways. What none of them understood yet was that the man who couldn't afford 2 plates had just set something in motion that 7 months of lawyers and leverage had failed to start. If you've ever done the right thing when doing nothing would have been easier, this one is for you. Subscribe to the channel and stay with this. What happens next took 12 years to build, and 7 months to bury, and 1 breakfast to bring back to the surface. The thing about working in cold storage systems for 12 years is that you stop hearing the sounds the way other people hear them. Most people hear a refrigeration unit and register background noise, the same way you stop noticing the hum of a highway if you live close enough to one. Darius Bennett heard components. He heard compressor cycles and condenser fan speeds and the specific pitch that a system makes when the load capacity is being managed correctly versus when something is being asked of it that it wasn't built to handle. He had learned to read those sounds the way a doctor reads a patient's breathing, not consciously, not with effort, but as a kind of ongoing background awareness that had been trained into him over so many years that he couldn't turn it off. This was useful when he was employed. It was less useful when he was sitting in a cafe with $21 to his name, trying to make a single breakfast plate look like enough food for 2 people. He had ordered the standard breakfast, 2 eggs, wheat toast, home fries, and had been moving portions around the plate for several minutes with the casual efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that he'd stopped noticing the choreography. The eggs went to Maya. The home fries he divided down the middle. The toast he kept for himself because Maya didn't like the crust and he could eat the crust without the toast and not feel like he was losing anything. Maya was 9 and hadn't asked why they were sharing. She had been not asking why about a lot of things for the past 7 months, in the particular way that children understand more than adults realize and choose not to add to the weight of what's already visible. She was drawing something on the back of a paper menu, a house with a large dog in front of it, which was a subject she returned to regularly, even though they lived in an apartment that didn't allow pets, and she ate whatever appeared in front of her without comment. Hearthstone Cafe was warm in the specific way that places with old radiators and good coffee are warm, the kind of warmth that costs something to maintain, and that the management clearly still considered worth maintaining. Darius came here when he needed to think, and couldn't think in the apartment, which was more often than he could afford. The breakfast special was the cheapest item on the menu, and the servers never rushed him, which mattered more than he would have said out loud. He had spent 12 years as a lead systems technician for Carlisle Harvest, a food distribution company whose refrigeration infrastructure he knew the way some people know their own neighborhoods, the specific quirks of individual units, the maintenance histories, the places where the engineering specifications and the real-world performance diverged, and why. He had not been fired for incompetence or misconduct in any sense he could honestly apply to himself. He had been fired for refusing to sign a document. The document was a safety certification for a new distribution center, a $12 million facility that was ready to open on a timeline that had been set before the technical work was finished. The contractor had substituted several key components during installation, replacing the specified parts with cheaper alternatives that weren't in the original design. Darius had documented the substitutions. He had noted that the system had not been tested under full operational load for the required 72-hour period. He had declined to certify it as safe until that testing was complete, because his signature meant he was attesting to something he had personally verified, and he had not verified it. Nolan Price had asked him to change the report's conclusions. Darius had said no. 2 weeks later, he had been walked out of the building with a termination letter citing willful insubordination and deliberate interference with business operations. 7 months after that, he was at a corner table in Hearthstone Cafe with $21 and a daughter who hadn't complained once. He noticed the elderly couple when they came in because he noticed most things. An older man, moving carefully, with a woman who had her hand at his elbow in the way of someone ready to hold it if needed. They were dressed simply, both of them chosen for warmth rather than appearance. They moved toward a corner table near the window, the kind of spot that gets chosen because it offers a view and a wall at your back. What Darius registered next was the manager. Sabrina Cole managed the cafe with the specific energy of someone who understood her position primarily as a set of metrics to be optimized. She had looked at the elderly couple before they sat down and made a calculation that took approximately 3 seconds and was entirely wrong. The exchange that followed was not long. The woman explained that their driver was a few minutes away and would be bringing their things. The manager explained that the table was needed. The old man tried to stand straighter, and Darius watched him grip the back of the chair in a way that was not a choice, that was the grip of someone whose legs were doing something unreliable. The woman's voice remained even throughout. The manager reached for the chair. Darius was already standing. He said they could sit with him. He said it in the same tone he used to say most things without flourish, without seeking permission, and he was already moving toward them before Sabrina had finished telling him that he was welcome to mind his own business. He pulled out the chair across from Maya, and the woman sat down, and then he pulled out the second chair, and the old man sat down in it the way a person sits, when sitting is the only thing their body wants to do. Sabrina looked at Darius with the particular expression of someone reassessing a situation. She took in his jacket, his work boots, the way he'd been sitting, and found no reasonable ground to stand on. She moved away. Maya looked up from her drawing long enough to take the situation in, and then looked back down. She reached into the pocket of her coat and produced a pair of knit gloves, navy blue, slightly pilled at the fingertips, and set them on the table in front of the woman without making eye contact. Darius lifted his jacket from the back of his chair and set it across the old man's shoulders without comment. He divided what was left on the plate into 4 portions. He pushed what remained of his share toward Maya, and she pushed one piece back toward him, and they settled the negotiation without words, the way they always settled things. He learned their names partway through the meal. Eleanor. Her husband was Henry. They had been coming to this particular cafe for years, the same table, the same morning, an anniversary of something they didn't explain and that Darius didn't ask about. Their driver had called from the highway with a mechanical issue. Their phones and wallets were in the vehicle with him. Henry was a talker when he felt steady enough to talk, which improved once he had eaten something and warmed up. He asked Darius what he did, and Darius gave the honest answer. He was between positions, 12 years as a lead systems technician for a food distribution company, currently doing general mechanical repair while he looked for something more specific. Henry nodded at this, in a way that suggested he was filing it, rather than simply receiving it. Eleanor asked about Maya, and Maya answered for herself. 4th grade. Liked math, disliked social studies, had decided she wanted a dog named Biscuit when she grew up, and described the dog with the specificity of someone who had given the matter considerable thought. Eleanor listened with the full attention of someone who had nowhere else to be. The alarm from the pastry case was not loud, but it was distinctive, a single sustained tone from a temperature monitoring system crossing a threshold. Darius heard it the way he always heard those things, not as background noise, but as a signal with specific information content. He looked at the case. The glass was foggy in a particular way at the top left corner. The compressor sound had the irregular quality of a unit running under strain. He had been hearing it since they sat down but had not been focused on it until the alarm framed it. Sabrina crossed the room and switched off the alarm. She pressed 2 buttons on the panel and the tone stopped. She looked at the case, saw nothing obviously wrong from the outside, and turned back toward the service counter. Darius said, from across the room, that she might want to pull the internal temperature reading on that unit before she restocked it. Sabrina's response contained the full weight of her opinion of his qualifications to have an opinion. She said that maintenance had cleared the alarm a week ago, and the matter was resolved. Darius said that intermittent alarms on a unit that had passed maintenance were a pattern worth looking at, not a problem that had been solved. He said it once, without heat, and then stopped. A younger man working the pastry station caught Darius's eye. Darius gave him the specifics quietly. Pull the internal probe reading, not the panel reading. The panel takes from a sensor near the top. The probe will tell you what's happening in the middle of the case, where the product is actually sitting. The young man returned 90 seconds later and said something to Sabrina in a low voice. Within 4 minutes, a team was moving product out of the case and into a backup unit in the prep area. The pastry case had been running 11 degrees above the safe threshold for stored dairy products. The food that had been in it for the morning service was pulled. The potential liability, food safety violations, illness claims, product replacement costs was not a small number. Sabrina did not thank Darius. She looked at him with something that was not gratitude and not hostility, but somewhere in between. The driver arrived while they were finishing the last of the coffee. He was a large man in a dark coat who came through the door with the urgency of someone aware that a delay reflects poorly. He called out their names Mr. and Mrs. Carlyle with practiced projection, and Darius heard it without immediately connecting it to anything. The shift in the room came from another direction. The young man at the pastry counter looked toward a framed photograph near the door, a picture of two people at a ribbon-cutting ceremony, both considerably younger, both smiling with the quality of people who had just finished something very hard. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the couple at the table. He said something under his breath. Sabrina caught it. She turned and looked at the photograph and looked at the couple and underwent the kind of rapid reassessment that involves not moving for several seconds, while a great deal of cognitive restructuring takes place. Eleanor Carlyle asked, in the same even voice she'd used throughout, whether the cafe could provide a copy of the temperature logs and maintenance records for the pastry case from the past 30 days. She asked for the camera footage from the morning's service to be preserved. She said it with the precision of someone who understood exactly what those records would show and what they would support. Henry had been watching Darius since the alarm went off. He had noted the way Darius had framed his concern, not as a conclusion but as a direction for investigation. He had noted the specificity of the instruction to the young employee. He had noted that Darius had not touched anything. When things had settled and the driver was standing by the door, Henry turned to Darius and asked his name again. Darius told him. Henry repeated it once. The way someone repeats a name they intend to remember. What came after happened mostly out of sight from Darius, and what he understood of it came in pieces over the following week. Eleanor and Henry went directly to Rebecca Grant, the company's chief legal officer, and made a specific request: pull the complete employment and disciplinary record for a systems technician named Darius Bennett, terminated approximately 7 months prior. Pull the records for the refrigeration certification project he was working on when he was let go. Pull everything. What Rebecca found was a record that divided cleanly at a specific point in time. Everything before Nolan Price's appointment as acting director was unremarkable in the best possible sense. 12 years of correct work. Problems caught early. No disciplinary notes of any kind. Everything after read like it had been written about a different person. The termination notice cited willful insubordination and deliberate interference. The supporting documentation described formal warnings that Darius had never seen, because they had not existed until someone needed them to exist. She found the certification report. She found the date his electronic signature had been applied to it. She found the date his system access had been revoked. The signature had been applied 3 days after his access was gone. Eleanor called Darius on a Thursday afternoon and asked if he would be willing to come in and talk. She told him they had found some things in the records that she thought he should know about. She did not make promises about outcomes, because she was not the kind of person who promised what she hadn't yet secured. She said she and her husband had a particular interest in understanding what had happened, and that his account would be important. Darius sat with the phone for a long time after the call ended. He thought about 7 months. He called Eleanor back and said he would come in. The conference room where Darius met with Rebecca Grant on a Monday morning was nothing like the rooms he had worked in for 12 years. Rebecca was in her mid-50s, with the specific kind of efficiency that comes from decades of legal work where imprecision has consequences. She had a legal pad in front of her and a recorder running, and she told him about the recorder at the start, which he appreciated. He told her about the refrigeration system. He told her about the contractor substitutions. The components that had been specified in the design documents were not the components that had been installed, and he had documented the discrepancy because that was what inspection notes were for. He told her he had not concluded the system would fail. He had concluded that it had not been tested under operational load conditions for the required duration, which meant he could not sign the safety certification in good conscience, because his signature meant he was attesting to something he had not verified. He told her what Nolan Price had asked him to change the report to say. He told her what he had said in response. He told her what happened over the following 2 weeks, the warnings he'd received, the termination meeting, the moment he was walked out of a building he had worked in for nearly a decade. Rebecca listened to all of it and wrote on her pad and did not interrupt. What she showed him afterward had the quality of confirmation. The certification report in the company's records had Darius's electronic signature on it. The conclusions in that version were not the conclusions he had written. The report described a system that had been fully tested and verified as operational, which was not what his notes said, because his notes said the testing was incomplete and the verification was pending. Rebecca showed him the date the signature had been applied to the document. She showed him the date his system access had been revoked. The signature had been applied 3 days after his access was gone. Someone had taken his credential and used it after he was gone to finalize a report he had refused to finalize, to attest to a verification he had refused to attest to. She told him about the archive. Henry and Eleanor's son had been a board member with oversight of operational integrity, and he had been watching Nolan Price with the attention of someone who had seen enough to be concerned and was still in the process of gathering enough to act. He had not finished gathering, but he had gathered enough. The archive contained photographs of the substituted components with their part numbers, the original inspection data, and emails, in which Nolan had directed staff to prioritize the business timeline over what he characterized as technician anxiety, a phrase that demonstrated he understood the concern had been raised by a credentialed professional and had chosen to frame it as anxiety rather than analysis. Nolan's response, when he learned what Eleanor and Henry were doing, was not subtle. He put out a statement to several board members characterizing Darius as a disgruntled former employee who had used a chance encounter to manipulate two elderly people who were still in grief. He said the timing was not coincidental, that Darius had targeted the Carlyles knowing who they were and had constructed the refrigeration incident to appear useful. He then offered Darius a settlement through an intermediary, a number that was not nothing, accompanied by a non-disclosure agreement and a document acknowledging the termination had been for legitimate cause. The message said the offer would not be repeated. Darius read the settlement offer sitting in his car outside his apartment building. He sat with it for a while. The number would have covered the rent for the next 14 months and bought Maya the winter coat she needed. It was not an insignificant amount for a man who had recently been splitting one breakfast 4 ways. He declined. He called Rebecca and told her he was declining and why. Because accepting the settlement meant signing a document that said what happened to him was legitimate, and he couldn't sign that document any more than he had been able to sign the one Nolan had put in front of him 7 months earlier. The principle was the same. The stakes were different. The answer was the same. The investigation moved into its second phase. Rebecca had assembled the archive materials, the original inspection notes, the timestamp evidence from the system logs, and Henry's technical analysis confirming that the 72-hour testing requirement Darius had cited was the industry baseline, not a personal preference, not a conservative interpretation, but the standard protocol for systems of that complexity, operating at that load capacity. Henry confirmed that the component substitutions Darius had identified were real and consequential. Signing off before completing the required testing was not a judgment call within normal professional latitude. It was a deviation from established practice for the explicit purpose of meeting a non-technical deadline. Nolan, when he met with the board's legal team to give his account, was careful and practiced. He acknowledged a disagreement about the certification timeline, but characterized it as a difference of professional opinion. He said the project had been completed successfully, and the distribution center had operated without incident since its opening. He did not address the question of how Darius's electronic signature had appeared on a document dated 3 days after his access was terminated. What Nolan did address was Sabrina Cole. He went to see her at the end of one of her shifts, in the parking lot outside the cafe, the kind of meeting that doesn't happen in offices or over email. He told her she was being drawn into a complicated situation and that he could help her navigate it. He had prepared a written statement describing what had happened in technical terms. Darius had verbally directed cafe staff to intervene with company equipment, which constituted unauthorized interference with company property. Signing it would protect her position, which was currently under review. She signed it. She signed it because Nolan had the specific kind of confident authority that makes the alternative feel more dangerous than the choice in front of you, and because she had rent that was not forgiving of employment interruptions. She made the calculation she made, and she understood it at the time as the rational one. She went home and did not sleep particularly well. The board meeting to finalize Nolan's appointment as CEO was scheduled for a Thursday. On the Tuesday before it, Rebecca filed a request with the board chair to modify the meeting's agenda to include a presentation of material governance findings before any personnel decisions were finalized. The board chair agreed. Nolan's team found out about the agenda change on Wednesday morning and spent the rest of the day running calculations. The story Nolan had constructed was careful and internally consistent, but it depended on Darius's account remaining uncorroborated, the word of a fired employee against the documentation of an acting director with a completed project and a functioning distribution center. The archive materials changed the terms. The timestamp on the signature changed the terms, and Eleanor and Henry's standing to call the meeting changed the terms, because there was not a move Nolan had prepared for that addressed all three simultaneously. He reached out to Sabrina on Wednesday evening. He told her that her statement would be important context for the board. He said he would make sure she was protected through the process. She asked him directly if she would have legal support present at the meeting. She asked if she had anything in writing about the protection he was describing. The answers to both questions were no, and the call ended with the specific quality of a conversation in which one person has understood something the other person assumed they wouldn't notice. Darius spent the night before the board meeting at the kitchen table in the apartment after Maya had gone to bed. He was not reviewing documents, Rebecca had the documents, and he trusted her to present them correctly. He was doing what he had learned to do in the years of working in systems that other people depended on, running through scenarios methodically, the way you run through a diagnostic before you certify anything. He had told the truth. The documentation supported what he had said. Henry understood the technical argument. Eleanor had the standing to demand the meeting. These were the things that were true and that he couldn't add to. He made coffee. He looked at the drawing Maya had left on the table, the house, the large dog, the word biscuit in her careful printing. He drank the coffee. He thought about the morning in the cafe, about the alarm that he hadn't been able to not hear, about what he had known when he heard it and what he had said and why. He hadn't said anything to create an opportunity. He had said it because 11 degrees above safe threshold for dairy products in a busy cafe was a specific and correctable problem, and he was the person in the room who could see it, and not saying anything had never been a thing he knew how to do. He washed the coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. The meeting started at 9 in the morning. The board meeting was held in the main conference room on the executive floor. 11 board members, their legal counsel, Nolan, and his 2 advisors occupied the main body of the table. Rebecca and Darius sat at the end, reserved for presenters. Eleanor and Henry sat beside Rebecca, close enough to the center that their presence was structural rather than peripheral. Nolan had arranged himself with the ease of a man who had prepared extensively and expected preparation to be sufficient. His folder was open, his water glass was full. He had, by his own accounting, already managed this situation through the settlement offer, through the statements he'd gathered, through the framing he'd placed around Darius's account before the formal proceedings had even started. What he had not managed was Rebecca's request to present the evidence chronologically. She opened with the original documentation, Darius's inspection notes, with their timestamps, their specific technical language, their detailed identification of which components had been substituted and what the implications were for the testing protocol. She put it on the screen, and she walked through it the way a person walks through something when they want the room to read it, rather than hear a summary of it. The board members read. Several leaned forward. Then she showed the certification report, the version in the company's records, the version that had gone to the regulatory body. She showed the conclusions. She showed the electronic signature. She showed the date. She showed the date Darius's system access had been revoked. The signature had been applied 3 days after his access was gone. Henry spoke next. He had asked to address the technical portion, and the board chair had agreed. He had the deliberate quality of someone who had spent a career in rooms where the wrong word could cost something significant. He explained what a 72-hour load test was and why it existed. He explained the specific differences between the specified components and the installed components. He explained what Darius's notes said and what they didn't say, that they identified a problem requiring further testing before certification, which was not a prediction of failure but a statement about the limits of what had been verified. He said that the position Darius had taken was the technically correct one given the available data, and that any licensed engineer reviewing the same data would have arrived at the same conclusion. Nolan's lead advisor objected that the distribution center had operated successfully since its opening. Henry looked at the advisor with the patience of someone, asked a question they considered elementary. He said that a system operating without visible incident was not the same thing as a system that had been certified correctly. The purpose of proper certification was not to predict whether something would fail, it was to document that the person signing had verified it was ready to operate. Darius had not verified that, because the testing was incomplete. What the system had done afterward did not change what had been verifiable at the time. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get quiet when someone has made a point that can't be answered by arguing with its content. Nolan moved the argument in a different direction. He said the framing of this investigation had been shaped by a chance encounter between Darius and 2 board members who were still, understandably, in a period of grief following their son's death, and whose judgment about the significance of that encounter may have been affected by the emotional context. He said it carefully, with the specific gentleness of someone who is weaponizing concern. Eleanor said she would like to respond to that. She asked the board's audiovisual staff to bring up the camera footage from the cafe. The footage showed the cafe in the hour before and during the temperature emergency. The board members watched Darius notice the alarm. They watched him speak to Sabrina and receive her dismissal. They watched him turn to the young employee and speak quietly. They watched him sit back down at the table. They watched the employee go to the back, return, and speak to Sabrina. They watched the response to the temperature reading. What the footage did not show was Darius touching anything. What it showed, from start to finish, was a man who had heard something, said something, and sat back down. Eleanor said that Darius had helped them before anyone at that table knew his name. She said his action that morning had nothing to do with any company or any investigation or any personal history that had not yet come to light. She said she was not presenting that as legal evidence, but she said it was the reason they had looked, and that what they found when they looked was not a disgruntled former employee with a grievance. It was a documented record of professional misconduct, directed at a person who had done his job correctly. Nolan had one more move. He said that Sabrina Cole, the cafe manager, had provided a statement describing Darius directing staff to interfere with company equipment, which constituted unauthorized intervention regardless of outcome. The door of the conference room opened. Sabrina walked in carrying a single printed page and put it on the table in front of the board chair. It was the statement Nolan had prepared for her, still bearing her signature. Sabrina said she had signed that document because Nolan Price had told her it would protect her position and that he would make sure she was taken care of through whatever process followed. She said he had not been present to take care of her through any process. She said she had asked him, the night before this meeting, for written confirmation of the protections he'd promised, and he had not provided them. She said she was not there to make Nolan look bad. She was there because the camera footage existed and she had seen it, and she was not willing to let a signed document with her name on it stand as the official record of something she had watched happen differently. She said that Darius Bennett had not touched the equipment. She said that what he had done was tell a junior employee to take an internal temperature reading, which the employee had done, which had revealed an 11-degree overage on stored dairy products. She said she had been dismissive of his concern at the time. Then she sat down in the empty chair at the end of the table, and she did not look at Nolan. Rebecca brought the final piece forward. The system logs had been pulled by an independent IT auditor retained for the investigation. The logs showed every instance of Darius's electronic credentials being used, including the 2 uses that occurred after his access termination date. The auditor had traced those uses to a workstation registered to a senior manager in Nolan's direct chain. The board chair spoke then. He said that the board had separately received documentation showing that a directive to delete emails related to contractor substitutions bore Nolan's own electronic signature. This directive had been recovered from the archive, and its timestamp placed it on the same day. Darius's termination was being processed evidence Rebecca had provided to the board chair in advance, so he could verify it independently before the meeting. Nolan said he wanted to address the system logs directly. He said the interpretation being offered was one possible reading of the data. The board chair looked at him for a long moment and did not ask a question. The board voted that afternoon to suspend Nolan Price's operational authority pending a full independent investigation. The vote was 9-2. The subsequent vote on whether to remove him from the CEO candidacy consideration passed unanimously. The independent investigation confirmed what the documentation had shown. The report had been altered, the signature had been applied without authorization, the contractor substitution records had been suppressed, and Nolan had been directly involved in each of these actions. 2 managers below him who had assisted with specific steps were also terminated. The matter was referred to the relevant regulatory authorities for review. Darius's personnel file was corrected. Carlisle Harvest issued a formal written finding that his termination had been retaliatory and improper, and that his refusal to sign the certification report had been a professionally correct action consistent with industry standards. The company paid back wages, restored his benefits credits, restored his retirement contributions, and provided a settlement for the documented losses he had incurred during the 7 months he had been unable to find work. Eleanor and Henry offered him a senior position directly. He thanked them and declined. He wanted to go through the standard evaluation process for any available position, because he did not want to spend the next several years wondering whether he had been hired for what he could do or for what he had been through. The evaluation proceeded like any other. He passed it with scores that Rebecca later told him were in the top 3 of the candidates assessed that cycle. He was appointed Regional Systems Integrity Supervisor, a role with a salary better than anything he had earned before, full benefits, and the authority to sign his name to reports that said exactly what the data showed. Sabrina Cole was not fired. She had cooperated fully with the investigation, and the camera footage established she had not been part of any falsification of records or targeting of Darius. What she had done was sign a misleading statement under pressure, and that fact was part of the investigation's record. She was moved out of the management role at the cafe, not as retribution, but because the cafe's staff needed leadership that hadn't made that particular choice under that particular pressure. She was offered a position as a senior staff member at a different location, with a path to reapply for management after a review period. She accepted. Nobody called it a happy outcome, but it was an honest one. Several months after the board meeting, Eleanor called Darius and asked if he and Maya might want to come to the cafe on a particular Saturday morning. She mentioned that she and Henry would be there, at the corner table. He brought Maya. He ordered 4 full breakfasts, one for each of them, and paid for all of them. Maya ate hers completely, and then drew something on a napkin that she gave to Eleanor, who folded it and put it in her coat pocket. Henry and Darius talked about a systems upgrade being planned for the distribution network, and Henry had opinions about it that were specific and correct. They stayed for almost 2 hours. When they left, the cafe was beginning to fill up with the late morning crowd. A man came in by himself, middle-aged, coat, not quite warm enough for the weather. He looked at the menu board the way people look at menu boards when they're calculating. He looked at the prices and then looked at the door. Darius saw him. He reached over to the table beside them and pulled out the empty chair. The man looked at him. Darius gestured at the seat. The man sat down. Here's what I keep coming back to about this story. Darius had $21 and a daughter who hadn't asked a single question in 7 months about why things were the way they were. He had every reason to sit at that table, eat what he could afford, and mind his own business. Nobody would have blamed him. Nobody even would have noticed. But he heard an alarm that he couldn't unhear, and he saw 2 people being told their dignity was worth less than a table, and he did what he had always done. He said what he knew, and he moved toward what needed attention. Not because it would benefit him, not because he was building toward anything, because not doing it was something he didn't know how to do. That's the part of this story that doesn't get said enough. The people who do the right thing when it costs them the most are usually not doing it because they've calculated that it will work out. They're doing it because it's the only version of themselves they know how to be. Darius had spent 12 years signing his name only to things he could verify. 7 months of unemployment hadn't changed that. It had only clarified it. If you've ever been the person in the room who saw something, said something, and got dismissed for it, this story is for you. If you've ever been told that your standards were the problem, that your caution was inconvenient, that the system works better when people like you stay in their lane, this is for you too. The alarm went off. He said something, and everything else followed from that. Subscribe to the channel and come back. There are more stories here about people who held the line when it would have been so much easier not to, and about what happened when someone finally looked closely enough to see what they'd been carrying. You're not alone in it, and the record doesn't have to stay the way someone else wrote it.